the Roots of the Science podcast with your girl, Anne with an E.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Root of the Science podcast with your girl, Anne with an E. As usual, if you are new here, I am so glad to have you. It's always such a pleasure. Also, to my regulars, thank you so much for always coming back and tuning into another episode. It is such a pleasure to bring you this episode. A reminder that you can follow the podcast on the Root of the Science podcast, join the Facebook group, or at the Root of the Sci Pod on Instagram and Twitter. Exciting news, the podcast has a new home on LinkedIn. Make sure that you follow the Root of the Science podcast on your LinkedIn page so that you are updated for new content. Also, remember to follow on your favorite listening platform, be it Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you listen to your podcast so that you're notified when a new episode drops. Also, a reminder that there is a support the show link on the podcast. Please help in supporting making new content. Now, let's get into today's episode. My guest today is Sarah Nyakeri. She's an MSc student in Molecular Biology and Bioinformatics, and she's also the host of the Vulnerable podcast. In this episode, we hear about her wonderful podcast where she interviews scientists and gets personal with them, sharing about their academic journey. It is so important because the scientists talk about the struggles and some of the difficulties in pursuing a science degree. Also, we chat about her research on improving CCB vaccines for cows. She did it at the International Livestock Research Institute in Nairobi. Also, if you tune in, you're going to hear how she tried to convince me to take up hiking. All of this and of course so much more. Tune in. Hi, Sarah. Welcome to the show.
Hi, and thank you.
It's such a pleasure for me to have you on, and I'm really excited for my audience to get to know more about you. So before we get started, can you just give us a brief introduction? Who is Sarah? Where are you currently based? And just briefly, what do you do?
Okay, I'm Sarah Nyakeri. My middle name means born on the road. So I'm a scientist. I am an MSc fellow. I was an MSc fellow, former MSc fellow at International Livestock Research Institute. I'm still an MSc student doing Molecular Biology and Bioinformatics at Jomo Kenyatta University of Agriculture and Technology here in Kenya. My research is based on looking for new vaccine targets for a bacterial pneumonia that affects cattle called CBPP. I'm also a podcaster. Enthusiastic, passionate, informal science communicator, informal underline. My podcast is called the Vulnerable Scientist Podcast.
Awesome. Wow, you're like a all sorts box filled with so many things that you do, and I love it. We're going to get into everything that you do, in the course of this chat. But away from you being a podcaster, a scientist, an informal science communicator, who is Sarah away from all of those things? What do you do that is just for you, like your hobbies and things that you enjoy?
I love singing. I've loved singing for a very long time. I love listening to very good harmonic music, not just any kind of music, just very specific harmonic music. I sometimes, follow football. I'm a football fan, Arsenal fan. So I sometimes follow football.
Okay.
I was playing football, but now I'm not playing. But now my recent and active hobby is hiking. And that has been happening for, I think, a year now. And okay, so with regards to hiking, you said that this is a recent hobby. I know here, because you're based in Kenya, but here in South Africa, many people took up hiking, especially during the pandemic. So for you, was it also like during the pandemic, or was it just something that just sort of happened and, this is what you enjoy? Hiking came as a challenge. It had nothing to do with the pandemic because it was 2021. It was past the high pitch thing. And at that time, it was my birthday, and I was like, I need to do something that is uncomfortable, that I wouldn't do. Like, when I saw hikers, I was like, what's wrong with you guys? Why would you use money? Use money and go to a wild place with nothing to look at. Like, what's wrong with you? And even struggle, like, climb those mountains. What is wrong with you? And I used to wonder what's wrong with these people. And I used to despise that sport. This is a sport, I don't know how a hobby. And so I thought, let me do something for my birthday. It was actually my birthday. I was like, to celebrate my birthday, let me do something uncomfortable. Something I wouldn't normally do. So, I took up the challenge, did a hike, and I had I didn't have very good shoes. And we got to a spot in the hike which was very slippery. And at that moment, I don't know. There's that, you're going to die in the next minute. Like, that's what you're thinking. And you're like, I've never been in a situation where I don't have a plan B. I've always had a plan B all my life. Then there's this situation, I don't have a plan B. The people who are behind me, they're looking at me like, it's okay. I know you're fearing this step, but just keep on going. For me, I think I was already giving up at that point. And I think it's a very mental thing. I think at that moment I thought that was a very mental thing for me, and I thought I can't give up, because if I roll over, the rest of the people behind me will be in danger, right? So after, yes, of course, I got to the top of the cave. It was a cave we were heading at, and I just sat there and I didn't talk to anyone. Then we continued the hike, and I finished the hike. When I was about to finish, I was like, are we done? We should be continuing. It was about, I think, 17 kilometers. It was my first time to walk for a very long time, and still think like, okay, we should be continuing with this thing. So after that, I looked forward to doing hiking, and it really helped me to refresh and have happy hormones during the week. And also, I started enjoying the nature, like being in fresh air, silence, and really love silence. So that's why I kept on hiking. It really helped with my mental health. Yeah. Really helps me with that, yes.
That's so amazing. Maybe you are selling hiking for me now, because I am who you were before you started hiking. What you said, like, why are you paying money? Why are you walking this far? What is the purpose?
But you get to a moment, I still get to those moments, like when you're in the middle of the hike and it's so tough and you're like, why am I here? There's no internet. Like, I've paid money to be here. I would have been doing something else. Actually, it's a common thing when you get to those despair moments in the hike and people are like, why are we here? Why are we using so much money okay, not even so much money, but why did we could have been at home doing something else, but we are here. But, after the hike, the feeling after that, it's something, the only person who can understand is someone who's gone in a hike.
Okay, you know what? Maybe just for you, Sarah, I'm going to do it, because my friends have been trying to convince me and I keep saying no. So maybe this is my sign, and I should also probably try hiking. And whoever is also listening, who is also like me, I hope we can take up this challenge and we try. And that's so beautiful. I like what you said about how it becomes a very mental thing, and, taking yourself out of very comfortable situations. And look now, you loved it. If you didn't, you would have still been like some of us, watching and judging. But now you are enjoying the hobby or the sport. And I hope now you got better shoes.
I got better shoes. I had to buy better shoes. I had to buy good shoes, and I spent, money on that. But those shoes have really helped me to navigate very difficult hikes. And I love hiking, man. I love hiking. Yeah.
Awesome. So, okay, cool. We got to know you away from the sciences and everything that you do. I think it's very important for us to then get a sense of a picture. Before you were this person who you introduced yourself as a scientist, as the podcaster, etc., the fellow. I'm curious, for you, how did you get into science? Was it something that you always knew, like, okay, you know what? I love this, or was it because of, people who were around you, or is it something that just sort of you got yourself into and one day you're like, okay, here I am and this is what I'm doing?
Funny enough, in my high school days, I was very good with physics and maths. And I asked my roommate then, who was older than me, what can I do for these skills? Because I love spaces and all that, just, designing and all that. And she was like, you can do architecture. But when I went back to just list the things that I wanted to do, scientist, investigation, and all that, there's a whole list, like journalism, there's a whole list of things that I was interested in, and science was in that. But I remember even listing scientists, but I didn't know much about it until when I, in Kenya, when you're applying for university, you select the things that you want to do in a different universities. Then they just choose you for the available position that is there. So for me, it was my last option, which was actually biochemistry. The rest were architecture and nursing, but I went into biochemistry. I didn't know much about it, but in my second year, that's when I knew, so this is what you can do, because now I was going to attachments and saying, what is this? So just to answer your question, it's not something I was thinking about when I was younger, or I was exposed to when I was younger, but I don't know where that came from, but I remember just writing somewhere scientist. I have no idea.
Maybe sort of in your subconscious, but it's quite interesting that the more I've spoken to people, and we sort of all have similar stories with how we got into science, in terms of how, like, oh no, I just randomly chose a degree, and then here I am, and then later on I sort of found out what I'm doing, and I think it just goes to show with the visibility, or rather the information available, well, that was probably when we were growing up, about the courses. In your opinion, do you think, like, if you compare now and when you were younger, when you were in varsity, do you think that sort of changed, or do you think that's still sort of happening, where students just randomly pick a course and then they're like, oh, okay, this is what I'm doing, and the varsity, or rather the university, just places you in whatever is available?
I think when it comes to the field, the biochemistry, biotechnology field, I haven't seen the shift of got into this knowing what it was. Of course, with my podcast, I've met a few, like one or two people who knew what they were getting into, and that came from meeting, like, people come to their school in their career talks and talk about their courses, and it just happens that the person who they're attracted to in terms of what they are pursuing as a scientist, and they want to pursue a course in that. Those are very few rare cases, but most of the time I would hear that someone wanted to do medicine, for example, because the African thing. Yeah. It's not even an African thing. I think it's a parent thing, because those are the courses that have more money and all that. So then there's a cutoff. Of course, not everybody can do medicine, even if you've passed. Not everybody can be accepted to do medicine, because it is a government-sponsored thing. And if you go to parallel, for parallel, it's very expensive. So you find someone wanted to do medicine, then they find something closer to that medicine, and they find themselves in a biochemistry class, or something related to biomedical something. Then they're like, okay, so what? In the middle of the course, you're like, so what do you do with this course? At that moment, that's when you realize, oh, okay, so you can go into science, you can go into whatever this thing is. Actually, the reason why I was curious to know more about it is because the people I was with, they don't know what we are supposed to do with this, course. So I wanted to experience that. So just to answer your question, I feel like I haven't seen that shift, or maybe I've not been exposed to see that shift I still see students who are in university asking, okay, so what do we do with this thing? Because we do this outreach thing with BHKI. We've just done one recently, and there's those questions. So what do I do with this degree? So there's still that trend of people don't know where they're getting into. And I'm happy that I'm part of, what am I doing about it? Complaining, yes, we're complaining, but what am I doing about it? I'm happy to be part of an initiative where we're trying to put STEM courses in high schools. just for someone to see what this is about and if they want to go into it, knowing what they're going into. So, yeah. So there's still work to be done.
Definitely. But I mean, it's exactly what you're saying, that at least you are part of leading that charge, knowing what you went through. You obviously want the next generation or the people who are coming behind to have some sort of, a sense of awareness of what they're actually getting into. So you mentioned that you are doing your master's and you're doing it in bioinformatics and, sorry, what's the other part?
Molecular biology.
Yes, bioinformatics and molecular biology. And your project is actually focused on, oh gosh, I hope I pronounce this right. The virulence factors that can be used as a new vaccine candidate for contagious, bovine pneumonia. This is a bacterial disease that affects cattle. Okay, so I want you to please tell us what you're doing for somebody who's also listening, and hopefully they can also maybe be inspired. But obviously you're going to do a better job than what I just did with butchering your title. I am so sorry.
It's a funny thing when I was, this was an advertised position, the whole project, just the way you've named it. It was an advertised position. And I got a call back a year later because of the COVID thing. And when I got the call, the other end was like, I was like, I didn't know, I hadn't received the email. I hadn't seen the email because it went to spam. So they were like, are we still on for the interview? I'm like, which interview? There's a MSc fellowship you applied. Okay. Because I had applied for several in the same situation. So I was like, so which one exactly? Yeah. Because you're telling me the interview is in 1 hour. I have not prepared.
Oh my goodness.
Then she was like, identification of I was like, oh yeah, okay. I know what that I know which one that is.
She also didn't know how to pronounce
I get the feeling. Yeah.
Because I looked at it and I was like, oh my gosh, how am I going to say this? So, okay, please, being the experts, please may you say what you're doing for somebody who is like, what was Anne saying 2 minutes ago? So, yeah.
Okay, so the project is titled Identification of Virulence Factors that can be used as new vaccine candidates or targets for a contagious disease, pneumonia disease in cattle called contagious bovine pleuropneumonia. It affects the pleural fluid that surrounds the lungs. Okay. Yeah, in cows. It also affects buffaloes, but yeah, in Africa, the mainly affected countries, it occurs in cattle, and we're talking about food security and all that. Yeah. So what the project is about? So there's a problem. There's a problem where this particular disease, shortened as CBPP, is one of the notifiable. It's the only actually notifiable disease, bacterial disease, in the World Animal Health Organization. So if you have it in your farm, you have to notify everyone that I have this disease in my farm. So what does that mean? That means that I cannot trade in between countries because no one wants to get that disease, because once it affects your heart, the best way to eradicate it is to slaughter your animals, all of them. It's the culling. It's called the culling method. That's the best when it has worked for a country like, I think it's Botswana or Namibia, I'm not sure. But one of those countries, it has worked for them, and for them, they don't have that disease in their country. And it has worked for the Western countries and other countries. And with that, if you're culling, the government has to compensate you, for what you're doing. But which African country, like the very few... there's no money to do that. It's something that it's not applicable in African countries. So what's the best second method is to have a vaccine and use that method to eradicate it. treating it, there's an argument that if you treat it, then it doesn't really disappear. The animal becomes a carrier for that disease, so it will come again and affect your herd again. And if it affects a new herd, it can clear up to 50%. Actually, I don't know if I have to talk about this, but there's a certain situation recently where a ranch has like 50% of the animals gone.
Wow.
You can imagine, just because of this disease. So there's a problem. There's a problem when it comes to that disease. It's something that affects, the economic situation, trading between countries, and of course, farming and food. If you're killing animals, then it means you don't have milk. You don't have the other things that you need from a cow, right? So there's a vaccine, but the vaccine is not good enough. The vaccine sometimes it has a low efficacy. And that to reach that efficacy, which is about 50%, depending on different studies, or lower, 20 to 70, people have different studies that have shown that it has a very low efficacy. And to reach that efficacy, you need to keep on vaccinating the animals after 3 months to reach that efficacy. So which farmer will keep on doing that to protect the animals,
Yeah,
the other problem is there's a reaction. Sometimes it becomes related. It's a live vaccine. It's not well studied. Like this disease, the mycoplasma disease, are not very well studied. They are very difficult organisms to deal with. They're not very well studied, and we don't understand the virulence. What genes are causing this virulence or making it the disease, severe to an animal. So there's a certain reaction that happens when an animal is vaccinated with this vaccine. It's called a Williams reaction on the skin, and if not treated, it can kill the animal. So you're a farmer. Imagine you're a farmer. You have to think about, okay, do I vaccinate my animals and have this possibility of it not being as effective and also getting this disease from the vaccine. So there's a need for a new vaccine, and the first things that we're trying to do is to understand how the bacteria, the bacteria in question, interacts with the host. And the host here is the cows, and since it's a pneumonia disease, of course, that's the lungs, right? So that first point of interaction, we need to understand what's going on there. And the question that I'm addressing for my master's specifically is trying to figure out which genes are causing the killing of the lung cells. The lung cells are supposed to protect the animal, but they're being killed by this mycoplasma disease. So what is happening there? So for me to do this, I have to mutate different genes on the genome, just mutate different genes randomly. That's what I was doing, just create a mutant library, then use this mutant library and test it on the lung cells, of course, on the bench, not with the lungs, with the animal directly on the bench, and test which mutant will not kill these lung cells. If I find a mutant that is not killing these lung cells, then I'll find out which gene was mutated here, and know that gene was responsible for killing these epithelial cells, and use that to see if we can find a vaccine that not only prevents disease, it prevents infection. So that will be a very good vaccine. So we can use that information to create a vaccine that is better and that can protect the animals against the disease.
Wow.
That's pretty much it.
This is such important work that you're doing, and I commend the research. So in terms of the how far you are, have you had, I know this is a terrible question to ask any student, but have you been finding some success in terms of identifying these what you're looking for in your bench studies?
So for the past 1 year, I don't know, for anyone who's done E. coli transformation. E. coli is a different bacteria that is easier to deal with when it comes to transforming it, like adding something into it. it's easier to deal with E. coli. It's something that takes 24 hours. You know if your transformation worked or it did not work. But with Mycoplasma, which takes over 3 to 5 or 7 days to grow, for you to move from one step to another, and another different method to actually isolate the mutants, you'd have 2 weeks. So compare 24 hours and 2 weeks for you to know something has worked or something has not worked. So when I started I was getting mutants. They were not really a lot, but I was getting mutants. Then it got to a point where it was not working. Then I went to this phase where I was just trying to figure out, okay, so what is happening? Mm-hmm. Trying to troubleshoot, trying to, do different things, trying to see what I doing before, what has changed, So I went through that phase of trying to figure out what has happened. So that phase, taught me a lot about myself as a human being. Like, it's not even about the science. It taught me so much about myself as a human being. Like that energy of going back after you know this would work, then going back home and you do not have, or sleeping and and dreaming about having a plate that doesn't have nothing. So that when it comes to trying to make the project work, the part of creating mutants was very difficult for me, and I think that's one of the reasons why I started the podcast. Just talking about my frustrations and happiness, because there are days things will work and you'll be so happy. So yeah. So the part where you're creating the mutants was the hard most part, and by the time I was finished, I got I got nearly about a third of what I was expecting, or more of what I was expecting from it. I was expecting about 3,000. I got about 800 and something mutants. Yeah, so that was first of the hurdles that I got, but at least with that I can, at least I know what is working, what is not working. The other thing is establishing that protocol, trying to, assay and see which mutants are killing, which mutants are not killing these epithelial cells. So trying to establish that protocol in our lab is what I was able to do, but time was over before I could finish the rest of trying to assay now these mutants that I have, and even trying to make more mutants and all that. So with research, there's funding, right? And if funding is over, if you've not finished the part that you're supposed to be doing, then you can't really do much about it. Yeah, so when it comes to where the project is, that's where I am. I'm hoping to do more with it, with time, if we get more funding, and maybe do a PhD on it. And I'm really passionate about that project. That's the problem. Like if you're so connected with your project and trying to solve a problem, if you get to a hurdle, it becomes a personal problem. Yeah. So, yeah.
No, I appreciate you being so honest about it. That, like you said, that you get so personally invested. And with science, we all know this, whether we do lab studies or field work, it doesn't go according to plan always. And, there's always that steep learning curve because you have to learn different types of things. You work with different types of stuff. So, and life as well, let's just be frank. Life also happens in the midst of you doing your degree at whatever level, So these things happen, and these things, a lot of people can relate in various different ways. And you mentioned, before I get into this part, I hope and I hope that it all works out for you, and you are able to pick it up and yes to that PhD that you want to do. So you mentioned that, because of all of these things that you are learning on your own personal journey, you started, the Vulnerable podcast, the Vulnerable Scientist podcast, which is how you and I met, actually. Can you just tell us more about this podcast? You briefly touched on it, but
with addition, why else did you want to do that podcast? Why did it call for you to do what you're doing currently?
So, as I told you earlier, I had a thing that was working on my hands. It was working. Then it stopped working. Then, if there's a certain microscope that I was using that needed me to see if... because that was a detection method, an additional detection method to see if the mutants are real mutants. And since whatever I was inserting had a green fluorescence, I was, using a microscope that needed that green fluorescence. So when you stop using that microscope for a while, because you've not been getting mutants anyway, on the plate, when I finally wanted to, I was now, doubting, what was I getting earlier? What are those? So, just going back to your storage and seeing, can I see if they're still fluorescing? Are they real? And trying to compare with the ones that have not been. There was that. So when I got to that moment, I think around December, and when I was trying to figure out how the microscope was working again, I forgot. I couldn't figure, how do you change the filter? Where is the button to change the filter to a green, to show you the green fluorescence? Oh my God. I stayed in that, with the fluorescence microscope. It's in the dark room. I stayed in that dark room, went for my phone, didn't go for lunch, and I just sat there and just watched YouTube and I don't know what. I just forgot about everything else that I was supposed to do about that day. I was frustrated, man. And when time was over, I've not done anything that I wanted to do. Something I wanted to extract, I didn't extract it because, oh man. So I went home, and when I was nearing my place, I started crying on the road, and I wasn't ashamed. My tears were just flowing, and I got home. I got this previous night's pizza, and I started munching on it while crying, like seriously crying. Ugly crying. I'm like, oh my God, I'm so useless. I'm so, you just start doubting yourself. The imposter syndrome was, I think, at its heightened moment. And I talked about it. Now that's when I recorded myself talking. So I shared it with someone who, a few people who are still in science. And one person came back and said, oh man, I feel you. I know what it is. I would like to be vulnerable, we just talk about this thing. And then they came and talked about their frustrations of they're trying to make things work, or they're trying to, Then I started opening up. I was like, okay, so this is not a me problem. This is a problem that actually occurs with, a lot of scientists. So I started going for lunch and, sitting at the table, intentionally going for lunch with people and, just sitting there and just having conversations. And they're like, then I'm telling them about my frustrations. They're like, oh man, you have no idea. They're just talking about their frustrations. And I was like, I wish I could just put my phone and just record these people, because I know there's someone out there who's probably facing the same problems, but they feel that they're alone in this, because with the scientific community it's small, but at the same time someone feels alone some sort of way. So I was like, I should create a platform where someone can talk about their lows and also the highs, because the highs are also important, So that's how the podcast came about. I started, approaching people because it's a very vulnerable space, and the theme is authenticity and honesty. I started reaching out to people who will be open to talking about their stories in a very vulnerable way, maybe their journeys through science, what have they faced throughout that, what has happened when they're doing science, just talking about that openly. So that's where the podcast came about. And I started and I saw like there are other people who are interested, just listening to the audience, and they're like, oh man, I love that space. Like it makes someone feel that they're not alone. It makes someone feel that if you see someone's win at a certain point, you're like, okay, I'll get there, or I'll get my win. So that feedback from the audience, that feedback from people who come into the podcast and feeling like, oh man, it's like some sort of therapy in quotes, like just talking about what has been going on. Yeah. So that made that vulnerability when it comes to being a scientist is what pushes me to keep continuing to listen to other people's stories and airing it out there, because there's someone who needs to hear that story. Yeah. You know,
Sure, go ahead.
When it comes to other careers like artists or movie stars or whatever, like someone sits with them and they listen to their story, and someone who wants to be an artist can see someone and see their journey, can listen to their journey and see this is where they got to. But in science, we only come to scientists when we have we want someone to explain what is this COVID, or I don't know.
Yeah.
Like that's when the scientist feels important. So I was like, people need to know the human side of the scientist, the people who are not in science, and also even people who want to come into science, they need to know what it takes. What people go through, so that when they get into it, they're more conscious and they're more ready to get into this space. It's like some sort of mentorship, some sort of, I don't know, just having real stories, because I'm not someone who's very passionate about listening to motivational things, because I feel like that's one-sided thing. It doesn't cover everything. But if you listen to someone's story and just pick lessons from that person's story, then you're way better than listen to one person's
I definitely
view
hear you,
about
Sarah.
life.
And I mean, like, I can definitely relate. You said something about how in scientists, they only come to scientists when they want to find out about the COVID or about diabetes or something. And I also believe it's because, I want to say it's like scientists are seen like this robot who is all intelligent, all knowing, and of course they cannot have feelings. And dare I say, even the culture of academia is so it's so like you're not allowed to really feel your feelings. But what I appreciate is that the way that we are going forward, the scientists, this new age scientist, we are so open with our vulnerabilities, like what your whole podcast is about, where we can talk openly, like this thing is destroying my mental health. I haven't been able to work for 4 months. I don't know why. And then somebody's like, oh my goodness, what? Me too. I had that part in my section. And you think this person is like exceeding, they've probably got their doctorate or their master's. And they tell you, these things happen. I had that happen and it's okay. Because I think sometimes we constantly put so much pressure on ourselves to be on all the time, to be charged. But this, like you said, like your experiments failing is hard. You're not being able to write is hard. There's just so much pressure. So I really commend the work that you're doing as well, and creating this platform for people. So definitely people should listen to your podcast, because they're so open and raw. And what I love about them is that they are so unstructured. Like a person can just come there and say, like, I remember what I said to you when I came onto yours. I was like, oh my goodness, Sarah, I'm busy pouring out my heart. No, it's almost like a therapy session. And I'm like, I didn't know I could say all of this stuff. So that's what I love about your podcast. It's just, go ahead.
So I just reminded me a comment that I had from a BBC. Someone from there's this BBC podcast that features. They just suggest different podcasts, and that time they were suggesting a science podcast that are factual to listen to. And my podcast was the first podcast they actually suggested to their audience. And the funny thing, when they were talking about it, they were like, we don't even know why we're suggesting this podcast, because they really don't talk about science. They're just scientists who talking about it. But what they were doing, they're like, I love that it's about a space where you see the human side of scientists, and it's like closes that gap between people. Because when you come and tell people, oh, there's this vaccine, there are these genetically modified products, but they feel like these are weird people. And I actually saw that comment from someone reviewing my podcast who's not in science, and they're like, when I thought about scientists, they were like, these serious people who don't laugh, and when when you listen to this podcast, you see how human they are, how, they're not weird people.
Humans.
They're just people like us. Yes.
Which is what we are. And, we face so many struggles as well. Go ahead.
Yes, yeah, that's true. So then that comment that you've made about, pouring your heart out, that guy commented that I don't know, have a thing where I create a space where scientists can just come in and just feel vulnerable, to talk about their story. And I thank you for saying that, honestly. Thank you for saying that. I feel like it's a gift or something.
No, you do.
Some sort of gift.
And I think, like I said, your work is so important. So everybody needs to check it out. You're available on all streaming platforms. And oh my goodness, also just say, everyone, this girl works. She releases podcasts like every other day. I'm just like, how? So please listen to her. You'll never fall short of finding content on her podcast. And you're doing such amazing work. And sometimes I got a question when I remember I was on a panel and somebody was like to me, and you're doing this work with your podcast, like you said, you want to amplify the voices of Africans in STEM, blah blah blah. And she's like, how do you feel about other people who are doing podcasts which are similar to yours, right? And I was like, oh, hell yes, please. Like, there just needs to be so much more. And I also said to her, I was like, a podcast, it's not a new idea, this whole idea of talking to people, but everybody's got their own special gift. Like how for you, it's that ability where somebody feels safe enough to pour out their heart and just, so it's quite beautiful how you can see similar content but tweaked in various different ways, because we have the same type of content sort of audience. We're speaking to scientists, but it's done in various different ways. So it makes me so happy that there are people who are doing all of this work, and it's such a pleasure for me to have you on, that hopefully somebody who is listening to my podcast or scientist who also wants to offload can safely do so and contact you on all your on your various platforms, because I think it's so important. Yeah. Sarah, we've been chatting for a minute, but with everything that you've gone through and all of the work that you've done in your podcast and with the journey with your studies, your master's not going according to plan, for somebody who's listening and who's like, wow, this lady is so vulnerable, she's so open and honest, what advice would you give them? Be it for pursuing a degree in the science field or STEM, or just in life in general, in terms of the things that you've learned so far?
Oh my God, I don't like giving advices.
Hey, you are like a therapist, so unfortunately, this is where we at.
I feel like if someone asked me the same question with the English podcast, I didn't know how to answer that question. But I feel if someone was to see what I do and where I am and they can relate to that, then they can pick small things that they would like to apply to their lives. But when it comes to being a scientist, I feel like what really contributed to me not handling my initial failures in a better way. I don't know what better way it will be, but I feel like I came from a space where I had been in different organizations, international organizations and national organizations that are doing research, and I was an intern in different labs. I felt like I'm so experienced compared to my peers. I was very confident, honestly. Now, this is being honest. I was very confident. And when I came to that project, I was so enthusiastic about that project, because I remember I asked in my interview, you mean you guys, there's no vaccine for this disease and it's affecting Africa like this? Then they're like, yeah, there's a vaccine, but, there's a problem with this vaccine, blah, 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 blah. Then I became very passionate about it. So there's this passion, and there's this scientist who's very confident that they can make this work in 6 months. I can get a potential, candidate for a vaccine in 6 months. Then in the 6th month, you're still in the lab figuring out, okay, so what happened here?
Yeah.
Science happened.
Science happened.
What I've learned is, I think, when you come into it, it's a good space. It's a good space to teach you so much about science, but again, it teaches you so much about yourself. How do you how do you manage first of all this project? Those are skills that people really don't think about. How do you manage your time? It really helps you manage your time. It helps you think about how do you deal with this failure. So for someone who's starting their journey probably into science, just be open to anything. It can be, your thing is working. How do you deal with it working, and how do you question other things that you can think about? Just it's about being open and being ready for anything. You can't really be ready, but being open to something might happen along the way, and you should be ready to know how to deal with that. Just be open to know that this might happen, and how do you deal with that part of this happening? Yeah, so I don't have an advance, honestly. Yeah.
No, this is advice. This is honest advice. And thank you for being brutally honest, because like you said, you come into your postgrad degree. I can relate to that as well. Confident, like, oh my goodness, I'm going to do some life-changing, amazing work. There's that bit of naivety, which is good. Please, I'm not saying people shouldn't be confident in their abilities, but like we said, it humbles you. It humbles you. It humbles you. It humbles your ability, and it's such a mental game. And so what you're saying is so it's so important. So thank you for chatting with me today. And
I'd like to give a shout out to my supervisor. She's called Dr. Elise Sheck. She has been very supportive. I'll recommend her to anyone. The way people recommend employees, I recommend my supervisor. She was very amazing in this journey. Yes, at this moment I still feel I should have done this, or I've failed in this. But she affirms you, and she supports you. She tells you, "This is what you've done. You've done so much." She just makes you see what you've done. She supports you to ask your own questions in the lab and not micromanage you and all that. So that's a shout out to my supervisor, Dr. Elise Sheck from International Livestock Research Institute, as the mycoplasma scientist.
Oh, awesome! I love shout outs to good supervisors. Great supervisors are so important. So I'm glad that she was so important to your journey. And like I said, again, thank you for coming on, for being honest, for being vulnerable on my podcast. And just briefly, where can people just give a shout out on your podcast where they can listen, your social media pages? Although I will put them in the links, but just for you to quickly shout them out.
You can also find it on any other social media platform as the Vulnerable Scientist Podcast, or at our handle at TV Scientist Pod in any Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, and any other. You can also find the episodes on any podcast listening platform, Spotify, Apple Podcast, and Google Podcast, and such like. Just Google the Vulnerable Scientist, and you'll see, a certain weird picture there. And listen to it and let me know what you think about it.
Yeah, awesome. No, thank you so much, Sarah. It's been such a treat chatting with you today. And to everybody else who's listening, thank you once again for tuning into another episode of the Root of the Science podcast with your girl, Anne with an E. Until next time, goodbye.